Hello BookTube, and welcome back to BookTrek 2021. This is a 5-month mission I'm embarked on with a bunch of other intrepid booktubers in which we're reading Star Trek fiction. And since there's so much Star Trek fiction out there to read, we're breaking it up franchise by franchise. So August is the original show, the original series, My Star Trek, the real Star Trek, Kirk, Spock, and McCoy. So those are novels that deal with the original 3 seasons of the show, that deal with the animated series, or that deal with any of the movies. And over the course of August, when we've been looking at these novels, when I've been looking at these novels, I have mentioned an element that I find fascinating, which is that in the course of Star Trek, of the development of the Star Trek fictional universe, time entered into the equation. Not time travel, but actual age, so that the characters that we knew when they were in their early 40s and late 30s in the 1960s, we watched them get older, and because fans insisted that they not be recast, the fictional universe in which they occur had to change. In other words, it had to become possible for Captain Kirk to have a career that spans 35 years. That's amazing. And it's fruitful grounds for writing, for fiction. I would say that the fiction about anything after the original 5-year mission of the Starship Enterprise is woefully underrepresented. There's a lot there. I imagine that some of that underrepresentation comes about as a result of Paramount's own edict. Don't be setting up anything that we're going to have to invalidate. Don't be confusing people. Don't, in other words, create anything much along the lines of the extended universe of Star Wars fiction. Just don't do it. No major developments, no major events, no characters marrying, no children, no new Jedi Order, no nothing like that. Don't do anything like that. That edict, I believe, existed for a long time and has been lifted. Star Trek, there are extended Star Trek fictional franchises that deal with all kinds of things, that deal with the interlocked fate of many dozens of characters and the future fate of the Federation. But for a long time, that wasn't true. And that's what I've largely been encountering in those numbered novels, those numbered Bantam novels. But recently, probably psychologically because I'm shifting to the next generation, recently I have been thinking more about those later years, about our core characters stopping being a united crew. And I was talking about that in the last couple of videos, and for today's book I decided to go to the novelization of the movie that really epitomizes that late period original crew, which is Star Trek The Undiscovered Country, Star Trek VI. The novel was written by J.M. Dillard from a screenplay by Nicholas Meyer, the director, Denny Martin Flynn, and from a story by Nicholas Meyer, Denny Martin Flynn, and Leonard Nimoy. And J.M. Dillard has written a few other Star Trek novels. He wrote a Star Trek novel called The Lost Years that's actually very good. But it isn't quite good enough so that he was disqualified from my considerations. In my BookTrek 2021, I'm intentionally skirting away from authors that I deeply, deeply love, and I'm skirting away from books that I've read 1,000,000 times to sort of explore the stuff that I don't know as well. I've had a number of emails from a number of Trekkies out there saying, well, we want to hear you talk about the books and the authors that you really love. But nevertheless, I'm holding firm. And I only have to hold firm for a few more days. I don't have much in the way of favorite literature from Star Trek The Next Generation, so we should be in the clear. But I went to the novelization of this, which is a thankless kind of writing. Not financially. Usually, financially, it's a thankful kind of writing. It's a rock-solid job. And unlike with your publisher, who will take you out to dinner and get you a little bit tipsy and leave you in a cab perfectly happy to sit on the advance for a little bit while longer. Yeah, you know how things go. You're a good kid. Go ahead. Go on home. Your work is wonderful. You're the next Hemingway. But the checky poo doesn't come. But with a studio, even a studio-sponsored publisher, that tends not to be true. I've known a couple of people who wrote Star Trek novels, and they were always happy when they got the brief because it meant reliable money. and was, after a fashion, easy work. The work doesn't get any easier than this. The novelizations of movies are the descendants of what James Blish was doing 50 years ago, where you take a script and maybe some dailies, but probably not. Probably just a set script, and you write the book. You write the book that will sell in the stores. There's very little point in doing that if your book isn't going to appear in stores either immediately as the movie is coming out or just before. So, in a way, the authors who write these finished books are flying a little blind, which accounts for the notorious inconsistencies that tend to show up in movie novelizations as opposed to the movies that end up on the screen. Last-minute changes can't be caught in the book. And although the writer might consider it a thankful task, it's usually thankless. I've met many people who read franchise science fiction, whether it's Battlestar Galactica or Star Wars or Star Trek or you name it, and even the diehard fans tend to shy away from reading novelizations of movies because they figure, I already know everything about the story. Why would I do it? Why would I bother? I think they're enjoyable. I like them a lot. I was conditioned to give them a fair shake by two different things. One was George Lucas's novel, Star Wars, which I read before I saw the movie, and which I believe was out in bookstores before the movie came out, and which I think was written before the movie was made. I could be wrong about that last one, but the novel is not papier-mâché thin at all. It's in fact very, very textured. That was one thing that made me look favorably on movie adaptations, and the other was, as you all know if you've watched this channel, Jaws 2. The novelization of the movie Jaws 2. Now, Jaws 2 as a sequel, I think, is a terrific movie. Just terrific. In some ways, more terrific than heresy, I know, but more terrific than the original Jaws. And the novel is much better written than Peter Benchley's original novel, except in a couple of cases, except a couple of passages. So I was already predisposed to give novelizations of movies a fair try. Well, I went back to this one anyway. I honestly don't remember. I know that I must have read it when it came out, but I honestly don't remember. I didn't remember anything about it. I remember quite a bit about novelizations connected around this time in the franchise, but not this one. And as I mentioned yesterday, Star Trek VI is a very strange movie. It's exciting, as everything that Nicholas Meyer was ever involved in is exciting. It's kinetic. It doesn't have any longueurs. Nicholas Meyer doesn't do longueurs. But it's weird. It has callbacks all over creation, not just to Star Trek continuity, but to history. Just all over creation, so that from one minute to the next, you're not sure what the parallels are or what point you're supposed to be taking. I refer just to one particular instant in the movie when General Chang, who has Captain Kirk and Dr. McCoy on trial for assassinating the Chancellor of the Klingon Empire, Gorkon. They are on trial in front of a room full of Klingons and a Klingon judge. Chang is prosecuting them and asks Kirk a bunch of badgering questions. And the final question that he asks, Kirk and McCoy have these sort of translator headsets. Why they don't have the universal translator, I have no idea. I think it was to draw an analogy to proceedings that maybe as a Nicholas Meyer might be young enough to remember as a little boy. Certainly Leonard Nimoy would remember them. Of a Soviet official being interrogated at the United Nations, where they had big bulky headset translators just exactly like the ones in this 23rd century movie, where if you needed those headsets, they would be marble-sized floating motes all around the room. You wouldn't certainly be holding up something to your ear. And I think the reason that was done is so that General Chang could then explicitly echo that Soviet-era interrogation by angrily saying, "Don't wait for the translation, answer now." It was actually an American that said that a million years ago, and it might have stuck in the mind of the older people who were involved in creating the movie. And you get odd, lopsided stuff like that all over the place. We get, for instance, Lieutenant Valeris, because for some reason, known only to the mucky mucks at Paramount, No one wanted Lieutenant Savick to be in this movie, played by either of the actresses who had played her before. Instead, it's Lieutenant Valeris, who is very much like Lieutenant Savick in that she has an odd name. It doesn't sound like a Vulcan name, and also she doesn't act like a Vulcan. And we're just left completely wondering who this person is, why she is the way she is. We know that she's a Vulcan. Spock sponsors her at the Academy. She's referred to as a Vulcan, but she doesn't act like a Vulcan. So we don't get any answers to that question at all. She's just in the movie. Same thing with General Cord, the old, cynical, obese Klingon general, a legendary Klingon general in Star Trek V. Jim Kirk in Star Trek V says that Cord's military adventures are required reading at the Academy. So he is a legendary figure in two different governments, the Federation and the Klingon Empire. And he's washed up in Star Trek V, and we can just assume that he would be part of a Klingon mission to seek peace with the Federation, which is what happens in this novel. We can just assume that Chancellor Gorkon would be heavily relying on him, since in just the last movie, which in Star Trek continuity had to be only at most a year earlier than the events in this movie, Cord is making nice. He's drinking with Scotty. He's making nice with the Federation. And who knows what the reason is. Maybe the actor wasn't available. Maybe the studio mucky mucks said, no, we don't want any holdovers from the previous movie. We want to break new ground here. Stuff like that. When you're watching Star Trek VI, if you're familiar with the movie franchise, you're watching it and just wondering what on earth is going on here. And also the thing I mentioned yesterday, the foremost discontinuity, is that this seems like a very different Jim Kirk. This is a Jim Kirk who hates the Klingons. Just fundamentally hates them in a racist way. He hates all Klingons, not just the ones who killed his son, but all of them. He doesn't trust them. They're animals. He's willing to let them die. He's willing to countenance genocide. And that isn't the Kirk in Star Trek V at all. I remember watching this movie in the theater, and I loved it. And don't get me wrong, I'm not criticizing. The movie is incredibly effective, even though it has all these weird things in it. Like a physical galley where cooks on board the Enterprise make mashed potatoes in big vats. What happened to the replicator? A physical galley in which if a phaser goes off on board a ship, alarms go off everywhere, and everyone comes running to the place where the phaser went off. Not security, but Uhura or Scotty or whatever. Security is literally the last. They're the last people to arrive on the scene of a phaser being discharged on board the flagship of the Federation. And also, for some reason, the phaser dematerializes the vat, but not the mashed potatoes. All that kind of stuff. I remember watching this movie and thinking, how strange this is. In many ways, this feels like Nicholas Meyer trying to make a sequel to Star Trek II. It feels more claustrophobic. It feels more military. It shares a feel on camera with Star Trek II, and not with any of the Star Treks in between. But when I was watching the movie in the theater, the line that jumped out at me at the most was Kirk, a sort of morose, almost self-pitying Kirk, in his cabin dictating his captain's log, talking about how the Klingons are now suing for peace. They want to write a new page in history. And then he says the line, but how can history get past people like me? And I had two simultaneous reactions. Number one, that's not the Jim Kirk we know. The Jim Kirk we know from the original series, from a lot of the movies, has been the ultimate idealistic son of the Federation, as pre-Paramount Star Trek fiction called him. The ultimate Federation true believer. Not a diehard, not someone old and crusty, not a bigot. Someone who wants to summon the future. So on the one hand, I had that reaction. On the other hand, I had a fairly positive reaction saying, well, okay, but you don't want a static character. What about a Jim Kirk who grows bitter and maybe even a little racist over time? This is a Kirk who's in his late 50s. That's going to be a very different person than someone who's in his early 30s. Why not? And who's to say that such a character, as beloved as they were, would get universally better? I think that was part of the huge furor that arose over Ghosts How to Watchmen by Harper Lee. Not only, I mean, the controversy about that book was partly because people were wondering, was it her family's literary estate that made the author put her name on this thing when it might not have been her work at all? But I think a large part of the furor arose from the fact that Atticus Finch in that novel is not nice. He's not a nice person. And you have something of the same reaction when you're seeing a bitter, caustic Jim Kirk in Star Trek 6. I told myself before I made this video that I wouldn't just make the video about talking about Star Trek 6, the movie. So let's talk about the book a little. The book actually fleshes in a lot of details, including one reason, J.M. Dillard's reason, why Kirk would be so changed in his attitude towards the Klingons. And it's personal. It's intensely personal. But Dr. Carol Marcus from Star Trek II, Kirk has been just dreaming that when he retires from Star Trek, he will take up with her again and they will be a happy married couple. He isn't really, in Kirk's style, he isn't really paying that much attention to what she wants. And in the book, she is working on a science station that is attacked out of nowhere by what will clearly we will learn is the prototypical Klingon bird of prey that can fire while cloaked in this movie. That bird of prey attacks the science station, kills a whole bunch of people, and badly injures her, so that she's on life support when the novel of this movie begins. And even the best doctors in the Federation aren't sure that she'll live. And Kirk is naturally on edge about that. It's not just his son. In this book, we're told that Kirk's son David is killed by the Klingons 10 years ago. 10 years before the events of this novel. A long time, in other words, for Kirk to come to terms with it. It's a far more recent thing, is that Carol Marcus has been gravely injured by a Klingon attack. And we also learn a lot more in this book about Spock's ideas of making peace, extending the olive branch with the Klingons, and also a little bit more about what happens that causes the Klingons to do this. In the movie, it's just bewildering. Absolutely bewildering. Some of you will remember the movie where the Klingon moon Praxis explodes at the beginning of the movie. And we're told that it was their chief energy production facility, and that without it, the Klingon Empire has 50 years of life. And I was watching that in the theater, and I was thinking, the Klingon Empire has thousands of worlds. This is not Chernobyl. This is not Chernobyl. This is not the Russians. This is not Chernobyl. There are plenty of other places where the Klingon Empire can get dilithium and a whole bunch of other energy. And even if they couldn't, it wouldn't kill the planet Kronos, the homeworld of the Klingon Empire. It's weird. It's weirdly parochial. It is a case of a seasoned director and a seasoned writer just deciding it doesn't make any sense in the continuity of this particular science fiction, but we want to do it anyway. So just say they got all their energy from one place. This whole galactic empire got all their energy from one place, and when it explodes, they were doomed. Far more intriguing option that is sort of floated a little bit in this book deals with the Organians, who are completely unmentioned in Star Trek V or Star Trek VI, understandably so. Old-style fans of the original show, will remember the Star Trek episode where we meet Commander Kor, the Klingon Commander Kor, and where the Federation and the Klingons are at war with each other. When that war is stopped by a race of super energy beings called the Organians, who tell Kor and Kirk that they will no longer permit these two societies to war with each other, and that they have the supernatural or super scientific ability to do that. They impose the Organian Peace Treaty. And that is why, in the course of the episodes and in the course of most fiction, there's an uneasy truce. That's why what we're reading about is not, as is invoked in this novel, 70 years of unremitting war. The reason it's not is because of the Organians, but in the world of Star Trek fiction, it is discussed in a few books that the Organians don't seem to be around anymore. They seem to have disappeared. They certainly don't seem interested in enforcing the Organian Peace Treaty, which was never really a peace treaty anyway, as the Klingon characters point out in a few novels. It's not a peace treaty if it's imposed on you. The two sides didn't come to the table. They just wanted to continue operating, so they had to stop. They had to leave each other alone. Whereas in the beginning of this novel, whatever the reason, whatever happens on Praxis, the Klingons do have to, the Klingons on the Federation do have to work out a peace treaty, an actual peace treaty, the Khitomer Accords. They have to make a peace treaty. without any supernatural beings telling them to, just because there's no way to get along otherwise, and also because by this point it was well known and belovedly embraced by Star Trek fans that the Klingons and the Federation are at peace in the future. So why not make Kirk instrumental in that peace? Why not add to the legend of this character? So as you know, if you watch the movie, that's what happens in this novel. The Klingons, Chancellor Gorkon and his party, travel under a flag of truce with Kirk and the Enterprise as their escort. Where Kirk is told at the beginning of the story, in both cases, he says, "Well, why? Surely a diplomatic corps would be better suited for this task than I am." And he's told the Klingons don't like the idea of peace any more than we do, and they'll think twice about attacking this mission if it's being guarded by the Enterprise under your command. Kirk points out many times in this novel that Sulu, Captain Sulu, commands the Excelsior, which is a far more powerful starship. But it doesn't matter. Kirk is the legend in the Klingon Empire. And that is what they're counting on. He is a legend, and therefore the Klingons will give him a wide berth. It doesn't turn out to be true. I realize that it's been a very long time since this movie came out, and this book as well. I guess there's still theoretically the idea of spoilers. I find that hard to believe. But I guess I should operate under that assumption. Kirk and McCoy are put on trial for the execution of the Klingon Chancellor Gorkon. And that creates a beehive of activity in the Klingon Empire and in the Federation. And on board the Enterprise, which is way out in the middle of nowhere, having been stopped from escorting the Klingons, and which has been ordered by Starfleet Command to get back to Earth. The last thing we want is the Enterprise further complicating what has now become an incredibly complicated situation. So come back to Earth. Naturally, Spock and the rest of our original series crew are not going to obey that command. And what follows is very gripping. It's every bit as gripping in the book as it is in the movie. In fact, a little more so, because Dillard is able to add details. And I don't know, like I mentioned, I don't know where those details come from. Ordinarily, in a normal novel, I would say they come from the creativity of the author. But I don't know where they come from in this case. Did Nicholas Meyer, who knew perfectly well that he was going to direct the movie, did he actually imagine the extra scenes that are in here that we get? The involvement of General Cord? The involvement of Carol Marcus? Did he actually imagine that maybe he could work those things into his movie? And so that was part of the working script that was sent to J.M. Dillard, or not? J.M. Dillard is the only person who would know. I don't know. This is enjoyable, though, and it has a lot of farewell moments. There's a moment in this novel where McCoy is on the turbolift with Jim Kirk. He's headed to the bridge, whereas as people have commented many times before, a doctor has no business being. Doesn't matter. He's Kirk's best friend. But there's a scene in this novel where McCoy is on that turbolift going with Kirk and realizes this is probably one of the last times this will ever happen in my life. And he feels just a seep of sadness about that. There is a kind of sadness that unavoidably wreaths itself around these late adventures of the original crew. I don't know. I don't know that you would feel it in the same way with any other franchise. These were the groundbreakers. This particular crew, in the minds of a lot of Star Trek fans, just can't ever break up. They'll always be out there having adventure. This is the end of that, and it becomes a movie, which is officially the end of that. The Enterprise literally rides off into the sunset, and we get that great ending sequence where the actors' signatures morph onto the screen, as if they were literally signing off on a life's work, no matter whether they put in guest appearances elsewhere or not. Spock says in both the movie and the novel, he tells Valeris, "This is my last voyage on this vessel as a member of its crew." Kirk is certain that he will never command the Enterprise again. McCoy is set to retire. Scotty is set to retire. There's a farewell kind of feeling in this novel, but I thought it was really good. Much better than, for instance, the novel of Star Trek V, which also had lots and lots of extra detail in it. So it's once again a recommend, although once again I could not possibly recommend this to someone who had not seen the movie. there's just too much that I'm sure that the authors, the writing team, had their hearts in the best places, but there's just too much going on here that isn't grounded in the way that a novel would have grounded it. So if you've seen the movie and you really like it, you like it as much as I do. The only reason I'm not going on for 45 minutes about the movie alone here is because I'm hoping to do that in a Zoom conversation with my co-host. But if that doesn't happen, I will spare a minute to talk about the movie itself. But the book is very good. So I think I may just continue with late Star Trek, I guess, late crew adventures. I think I may just continue with that for the rest of BookTrek 2021, and then shift into the next generation. Although you never know. I'm unpredictable, as sexy influences always are. Could pick an early episode tomorrow. Don't count your dilithium crystals. But in the meantime, I'm going to wrap this up. But I will see you soon. Thank you, BookTube.